Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking you on a journey, really, through the history of economic power. We're focusing on, well, the single most powerful tool in America's geopolitical arsenal, even if it's often unseen, the U.S. dollar.
Yeah, our mission today is to figure out how this, piece of paper went from what some called an immoral promise to basically the undisputed global king.
And crucially, what happens when that king decides to turn its influence into, well, a financial weapon?
It's a story just full of contradictions, isn't it? The dollar's dominance, it relies on things like predictability, stability, trust.
Right.
But its immense power today stems from how useful it is as a tool of war, which, inherently means inflicting instability on your adversaries. Our source material really gives us a stunning look into this core tension. It shows us exactly why the dollar is under threat today, and importantly, that threat is largely self-inflicted.
So, to set the scene, we're not starting way back, say, in some historical conference room. No, we're jumping right into a moment of high-stakes crisis, February 2022.
Right after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Exactly. And the U.S. had already firmly ruled out direct military action. So all the pressure, all the focus shifted onto economic statecraft.
That's right. I mean, when military options were off the table, the conversation immediately turned to financial warfare. It was seen as the strongest weapon, as our sources put it, this whole economic sanctions package.
And National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and his team, they proposed something truly drastic.
They knew it was the nuclear option, basically cutting off a G20 central bank Russia's, specifically from accessing its own huge war chest, like $500 billion stored in Western currencies, mainly dollars.
Wow. That is just an astonishing level of financial excommunication. You're targeting the entire reserves of a major world economy.
Yeah.
But this extreme measure, it actually hit some critical resistance internally, didn't it? From the very person who saw herself as the dollar's main guardian.
That was Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. You see, her job is sort of twofold. Yes, implement U.S. policy, but also, crucially, maintain the global health of the currency she oversees.
Right. She's the steward.
Exactly. And she hesitated because this action, it took the dollar's weaponization to a level nobody had ever seen before. The concern wasn't really about hurting Russia, not primarily anyway.
It was about damaging the dollar itself.
Precisely. The dollar's value, it isn't backed by gold anymore. We'll get into that. It's backed by the world's belief, really, that the U.S. is a safe, predictable, trustworthy place to keep your capital.
And if Washington, maybe without clear international backing, suddenly freezes the reserves of a major nation, even an adversary like Russia, that sends a really chilling signal around the world.
That was Yellen's core concern. If allied governments, G7, G20 nations, if they no longer saw the United States as this secure, kind of neutral place to store their assets, well, that bedrock of trust just shatters. She worried this kind of financial carpet bombing would hurt global markets, sure, but also specifically strain essential commodities like food and energy worldwide. You could hurt innocent people, allies, everyone.
So, okay, this is the ultimate paradox we're diving into today. The dollar's power comes from being reliable, stable. But to use it as a weapon, the U.S. has to prove it can be unreliable and destabilizing, at least to its enemies.
And you have to constantly manage that tension. It's a balancing act.
And that failure to manage it, as we'll see, that might just be the biggest threat the dollar faces right now. Okay, let's track the dollar's rise, because its history is actually full of these really radical breaks with tradition. The foundation, was laid back in 1789 when the Treasury took over national finances.
Right.
But the truly revolutionary idea, the one that really changed things, came much later during the Civil War, a really dark time.
That's right. For centuries, across the Western world, currency had to represent something tangible, gold, silver. Anything else was seen as, well, dubious, inflationary, even immoral sometimes.
So by 1862, the Treasury Secretary, Salmon Portland Chase, he was running out of gold and silver. He needed it to pay for the Union troops, the war effort.
Yeah, the economic thinking of the time basically demanded the Union just admit defeat. They didn't have the hard cash.
But Chase made a decision that essentially reshaped global finance forever. He didn't just give up.
He didn't. He caved, you could say, and adopted government-issued IOUs, paper currency, what we now call the greenback.
And this was revolutionary because it wasn't backed by gold or silver.
Exactly. It was backed by nothing but the future promise of the government. This was the moment American cash stopped representing gold and started representing the the full faith and credit of the United States government.
It's a huge leap of faith.
It was massive. But it worked, partly because it happened just as the U.S. was overtaking Britain as the world's largest economy. So
Yeah.
that paper money had immense economic power behind it, even if it wasn't metal.
And that economic strength, that really gave the U.S. the upper hand when the world needed a whole new financial system after World War II. Which brings us to, well, the dollar's coronation moment. Bretton Woods in 1944.
Right. Post-war, Europe was just shattered. The world monetary system was in ruins. At this conference, Bretton Woods delegates actually debated creating a truly unified global currency.
Oh, really? Like a world money.
Yeah, a neutral asset. The British economist John Maynard Keynes championed it, calling it the bank war. But the U.S. had things the rest of the world just didn't have then: wealth, stability, and commitment.
And a ton of gold, right.
Exactly. The U.S. held most of the world's gold reserves. So Harry Dexter White, representing the U.S., he successfully pushed to make the dollar the anchor currency. Gold became secondary.
How did that work
So
exactly?
the dollar became the only currency still redeemable for gold, at least by governments. All other major currencies were then pegged to the dollar at fixed rates.
Okay.
And America's commitment to funding reconstruction through new institutions like the IMF and the World Bank that just cemented the dollar's status. It became the reserve asset, easy to transfer, universally accepted.
And this leads right into the core mechanism of U.S. global influence today, what our sources call the power loop of dollar dominance. Can you walk us through how that self-reinforcing cycle actually works?
Yeah, it's surprisingly simple, but incredibly powerful. The world generally sees the U.S. as the most stable, reliable democracy with the deepest, most liquid financial markets.
Okay.
So when there's instability anywhere else, a war breaks out, a pandemic hits, a banking crisis erupts. What does everyone do?
They rush to safety, they buy U.S. assets.
Exactly. They buy dollars, they buy U.S. government bonds, treasuries. This massive demand means the U.S. government can borrow absolute astronomical amounts of debt. We're talking over $33 trillion by 2023 at extremely cheap interest rates. Treasuries are seen as the ultimate global safe haven.
So basically, the rest of the world gives the U.S. cheap credit, kind of subsidized by their own need for security.
Precisely. And that cheap financing then gets reinvested. It fuels America's huge military budget, its technological innovation, its economic growth,
Which in turn makes the U.S. more powerful and stable.
making the dollar even more attractive as a safe asset. It just keeps tightening the loop. It's often called the exorbitant privilege.
But this system, the Bretton Woods system with its fixed exchange rates tied to gold, it didn't last forever. It fundamentally changed less than 3 decades later.
No, it couldn't hold.
Yeah.
It really buckled under the strain of U.S. domestic spending, the Vietnam War, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. By the early 1970s, the U.S. was running big deficits.
And foreign governments start getting nervous.
Yeah, they're worried the U.S. didn't actually have enough gold left in Fort Knox to cover all the dollars they were holding. This put massive pressure on the greenback.
And then came the Nixon shock in 1971. President Nixon just unilaterally pulled the plug.
He did. He abruptly ended the dollar's convertibility to gold. And you have to understand, this wasn't just a domestic policy change. It ripped the entire world away from the fixed exchange rates they'd agreed on at Bretton Woods.
So what replaced it?
Suddenly, currency values were set by supply and demand in the open market, a floating exchange rate system. It was a seismic shift.
And that led to...
Well, it ushered in about 2 decades of pretty serious volatility, inflation, economic uncertainty. And that chaos really set the stage for the next big challenge, dealing with the power of the financial markets themselves. Right, that volatility in the 70s and 80s, it left governments genuinely terrified of the financial markets. Which brings us to the 1990s and the rise of these quite intimidating figures known as the bond vigilantes.
The bond vigilantes, the name itself sounds like something out of a comic book. Who were they exactly? What power did they actually wield?
Well, they weren't, a formal group or anything. It was more this powerful, kind of diffuse network of global bond investors, huge pension funds, hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, you name it.
Okay.
Their power came from their ability to basically judge government decisions in real time. If they thought government spending was getting reckless or might cause inflation,
They could punish them.
oh yeah, they could simply refuse to buy that government's debt or, more likely, demand much higher interest rates, higher yields to compensate for the perceived risk.
And the Clinton administration got a taste of this power early on, right? In 1993, when they came in with this big plan for middle-class tax cuts.
They sure did. Wall Street just flat out rejected the plan. They looked at it and saw a risk of the deficit ballooning, leading to inflation, which is poison for bondholders because it erodes the value of their fixed payments.
So what did the market do?
Their reaction was immediate and punishing. Bond yields, specifically the benchmark 10-year Treasury yield, just soared. They went from around 5.2% up to 8.1% in just 1 year. And you have to remember, that 10-year yield is the foundation for all kinds of long-term borrowing.
So when those yields shoot up, what does that mean for, say, the average American?
It means mortgages get more expensive, car loans cost more, businesses find it harder and more expensive to invest, economic growth slows down. It becomes political poison pretty quickly because voters feel that pain directly in their wallets.
Which explains why James Carville, the Clinton strategist, famously quipped he wanted to come back in the next life as the bond market.
Because you can intimidate everybody.
Exactly. The market essentially bullied the White House into completely rethinking its economic strategy.
And this rethink was led by Bob Rubin, who came from Goldman Sachs, right?
Yeah.
He brought a market-savvy approach.
Yes. Rubin and his team developed what became known as Rubinomics. They basically decided to stop messing around in currency markets directly. No more government intervention trying to push the dollar up or down.
Instead, they focused purely on
Economic fundamentals. Things like aiming for full employment, steady growth, keeping inflation low and predictable. The key was projecting unshakable confidence and stability to those bond vigilantes.
And this whole philosophy got summed up in just 8 words, delivered by Rubin at his confirmation hearing in 1995.
The famous mantra, "A strong dollar is very much in this nation's economic interests." It sounds simple, maybe even obvious.
But it was more than just a statement.
Oh, much more. It was basically an edict. It signaled predictability. It assured investors, loud and clear, that the U.S. government was not going to try and devalue the dollar just to get a quick trade advantage. And did it work? Did the market buy it?
Like a charm, it totally stabilized market expectations. Investors rewarded this stance by piling into the dollar, driving its value up by about 16% over the next 4 years.
And the Clinton era that followed, economically speaking.
It became a kind of golden age for the currency. You saw the longest period of economic growth the country had seen up to that point, like 4% annual GDP expansion. Inflation stayed low, around 2.5%.
And they balanced the budget.
They did, first time in a generation. They even left office with a $230 billion surplus. The dollar became the undisputed lingua franca of global commerce. It really seemed like the U.S. had cracked the code, just focus on fundamentals, project stability, and let the markets work.
But, there's always a but, isn't there? That stability, that strong dollar, it came with a hidden cost, a cost that maybe wasn't obvious on Wall Street, but was absolutely devastating for Main Street America.
That hidden cost. Yeah, that's the great painful irony of the strong dollar policy. While, global investors loved the stability, and American consumers definitely benefited from cheaper imported goods.
Right. Think cheap electronics, clothes.
Exactly. But that same strong dollar made American-made products, cars, steel, machinery, prohibitively expensive for people in other countries to buy.
And you couple that with globalization kicking into high gear, new trade deals like NAFTA, and especially China joining the World Trade Organization.
You get the perfect storm. It just hollowed out the U.S. manufacturing sector, creating what we now call the Rust Belt.
Because those cheap imports flooded the U.S. market.
Right. And at the same time, the high value of the dollar meant American factories just couldn't compete on price globally. Our sources point out that in the 3 decades leading up to Donald Trump's presidential bid, something like 20% of America's manufacturing jobs just vanished.
Millions of jobs.
Millions. And concentrated heavily in these small, often single-industry towns across the Midwest and Appalachia.
The sources use Weirton Steel in West Virginia as a really pertinent example of this kind of financial class war brewing between Wall Street and Main Street.
Yeah, Weirton was this iconic American steel town built around a massive plant. But they just couldn't compete with subsidized foreign steel being, frankly, dumped into global markets, often violating trade rules.
And the strong dollar just made that disadvantage even worse.
Compounded it, absolutely.
Yeah.
Weirton eventually went bankrupt, and the town just shriveled. The sources describe the aftermath as social and cultural bedlam. Meanwhile, the financial sector, benefiting from that low inflation and global stability fueled by the strong dollar, saw stock markets soaring.
It was a clear trade-off. Coastal elites, the financial sector, benefited, often at the direct expense of the industrial heartland.
It absolutely felt that way to millions of people. And the single biggest factor accelerating this, according to many analysts cited in our sources, wasn't fair competition. It was active strategic currency manipulation, primarily by China.
Okay, let's unpack that. How did China manipulate its currency?
So China's central bank, The People's Bank of China, or PBOC, they actively managed their currency, the yuan, also called the renminbi. They deliberately kept it massively undervalued.
How?
Essentially by printing huge amounts of yuan and using it to buy up vast quantities of US dollars in the foreign exchange market. This artificially suppressed the yuan's value.
Making Chinese exports
Dirt cheap, much cheaper than equivalent American-made goods. This absolutely slashed demand for U.S. products, both at home and abroad. One estimate suggests this manipulation alone accounted for maybe 40% of U.S. manufacturing job losses between 2000 and 2007.
That's around 2 million jobs just from currency manipulation.
Roughly, yeah. And here's the kicker, the ultimate Faustian bargain, as you put it earlier.
The U.S. got cheap TVs and sneakers, but lost its factories.
Exactly. And China, with its massive trade surpluses earned from those artificially cheap exports, what did they do with all those dollars they accumulated?
They bought U.S. debt.
Yeah.
Treasuries.
Precisely. They became the largest foreign holder of U.S. debt. So they were effectively subsidizing America's low interest rates and government spending, reinforcing the dollar's superpower status, while simultaneously gutting the U.S. manufacturing base that threatened their export model.
Wow. Both the biggest rival and the biggest banker.
It's an incredible irony. Recognizing this really complex structural problem, Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, under George W. Bush, established something called the Strategic Economic Dialogue, or SED, with China back in 2006.
What was the goal there?
Paulson tended to view China's currency intervention less as purely malicious and more as kind of structural, linked to their massive internal shift from a state-controlled to a more market-oriented economy. The SED was meant to create a high-level channel to handle these complex issues, trade imbalances, currency, market access, with a single, coherent voice.
But it didn't really solve the underlying tension, did it?
Not quickly enough for many in the U.S. The pace of change from Beijing was glacial. The Chinese leadership is often described as operating on a 1,000-year planning horizon. They viewed currency reform as a sovereign matter, internal policy. Meanwhile, U.S. lawmakers were getting increasingly frustrated, blaming China for millions of job losses.
And all that pent-up frustration, particularly in those flyover states, it just simmered and then eventually boiled over.
Absolutely. It created the political opening for Donald Trump. He tapped directly into that pain and anger with really intense anti-China rhetoric. Remember slogans like, China was raping our country, he promised punitive tariffs, trade wars. His victory really signaled the end of that stable, predictable, strong dollar era that has started under Rubin.
And the final nail in the coffin for the Rubin mantra came in 2018, didn't it? When Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin said something in Davos that sent shockwaves through the markets.
Just 7 words.
What were they?
He said, quite simply, a weaker dollar is good for us. Yeah. This just shattered a decades-old unspoken rule among global financial leaders. You do not talk down your own currency. You don't job-own its value. That's supposed to be left to market forces.
What was the immediate market reaction? I mean, the U.S. Treasury Secretary basically saying, we want our money to be worth less.
The dollar dropped like a stone, 2.1% in a single day, which is a huge move for currency markets. Mnuchin tried to walk it back later, qualify the statement, but the damage was done.
How so?
It just eroded America's credibility. It suggested the U.S. was now willing to ditch the stable, rules-based system it had championed for decades, maybe just for a short-term trade advantage. The era of predictability under the strong dollar policy was effectively over, replaced by a kind of transactional uncertainty.
Okay, so the dollar was the stable bedrock, then the strong dollar policy caused internal pain, and then that policy got thrown out. But parallel to all this, another transformation was happening. The dollar becoming an active weapon.
That's right. And the concept of the dollar as an overt weapon didn't really crystallize until the turn of the century. This shift from just being this stable reserve currency to becoming this aggressive tool of statecraft, that really kicked off in earnest after 9/11.
Because the attacks themselves targeted the heart of the U.S. economy, the World Trade Center, the Pentagon nearby.
Exactly. And the Bush administration realized they needed to fight back on all fronts, including financially. They decided to unleash the power of the Treasury Department before major kinetic military action really got going. The idea of financial warfare was essentially born out of that necessity.
And the core strategy was simple. Follow the money. Even though the 9/11 plot itself, remarkably, only cost about $400,000 to execute.
Right. But even relatively small amounts, transferred through wire services or moved as cash, they leave a trail. And the key government structures that emerged to follow those trails were the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, TFI, and especially the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC.
OFAC. That name comes up again and again. It became the beating heart of U.S. sanctions, as our sources put it.
It really did, and still is.
Tell us a bit more about the power OFAC wields. It seems almost outsized for its profile.
It's immense, and yeah, often low profile. Our sources share this great anecdote. The OFAC director's SCIF, that's the Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility where they handle top secret intelligence, it was apparently housed in a decommissioned bathroom, a loo they called it, in this dusty old building across from the main Treasury. It kind of illustrates the agency's unpretentious vibe compared to its massive global reach.
So what can OFAC actually do?
It has the unilateral power to essentially financially carpet bomb designated entities, companies, individuals, even entire governments. They can freeze all their assets held within the U.S. financial system or by U.S. persons, and crucially, block their access to using the U.S. dollar globally.
And how can they do this so quickly without long court battles? That seems key.
That is the key to its speed and power. OFAC doesn't operate like a court. It doesn't need to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It works based on classified intelligence and a standard of reasonable basis to believe that the target is involved in illicit activity, terrorism, financing, proliferation, human rights abuses, whatever the sanction regime targets.
So once you're on the OFAC list,
You're basically excommunicated from the dollar-based global financial system overnight. Trying to sue OFAC to get off the list is incredibly difficult and rarely successful. The power imbalance is just vast.
now to make this financial dragnet truly effective, especially after 9/11, Treasury needed a way to see global transactions, like a crystal ball, right? And they found it through a pretty controversial partnership.
Yeah, with SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication.
That's the messaging system banks use globally for transfers.
Exactly. It's used by something like 10,000 financial institutions worldwide to securely send payment instructions. SWIFT is supposed to be neutral, like the Postal Service for money. But after 9/11, the U.S. Treasury secretly worked out an arrangement with them.
To access the transaction data.
Yes. They saw this data flow as potentially crucial for tracking terrorist financing, for predicting al-Qaeda's next moves. The whole secret program was codenamed Turtle.
I can imagine that was incredibly sensitive, giving one government access to supposedly neutral global banking messages.
Hugely sensitive. It required really elaborate legal frameworks and oversight mechanisms, supposedly, to protect privacy and prevent misuse. But according to the sources, the intelligence results were significant. The program generated thousands of valuable leads.
And help stop attacks.
It reportedly helped thwart planned attacks in several countries, including Germany, Spain, and the UK. So in that sense, financial warfare had been honed into a potentially precise, effective counterterrorism tool.
But that precision didn't last, did it? The tool soon became much blunter again. The Russell case in 2018 under the Trump administration seems like a key example of sanctions maybe going too far, too fast.
Absolutely. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin decided to sanction Oleg Deripaska, a prominent Russian oligarch, and crucially, his company Rusal, which happened to be the world's second largest aluminum producer at the time.
The goal was to hit Moscow hard.
That was the aim. But unlike previous major sanctions actions, the administration didn't seem to fully coordinate with allies or adequately game out the potential market impacts beforehand. Those steps had become standard practice.
And what was the result? The global fallout.
It was immediate and violent, financially speaking. The sanctions basically choked off a huge chunk of the world's aluminum supply overnight. Prices for aluminum exploded globally.
Which threatened.
Factories across Europe, particularly in the automotive and aerospace sectors, that relied heavily on Rusal's specialized aluminum. They were suddenly facing shutdowns. Treasury officials were reportedly caught completely off guard by the sheer ferocity of the market backlash.
So the U.S. looked arrogant, maybe incompetent.
It certainly came across as unilateral and maybe not fully thought through. The blowback was immense, forcing the U.S. into a really awkward position.
What happened with Russell in the end? Did the sanctions stick?
No, the U.S. essentially had to backtrack. They eventually agreed to lift the sanctions on Russell itself, though not Deripaska personally, but only after he agreed to significantly reduce his ownership stake and relinquish control.
But the broader lesson was learned.
Oh, definitely. Globally, allies and adversaries alike took note. The U.S. had shown it was willing to unilaterally trigger massive global economic instability to achieve a geopolitical goal, even if the collateral damage was huge. It raised serious questions, again, about the risks of relying so heavily on the dollar system when it could be weaponized so disruptively.
Hmm.
So if Russell highlighted the dangers of, let's say, external overuse of the dollar weapon, arguably the biggest threat to the dollar's long-term dominance today is actually domestic. It's rooted in self-inflicted wounds and, frankly, internal political chaos.
And top of that list has to be the recurring drama over the U.S. debt ceiling.
Absolutely. This congressional limit on how much the federal government can borrow it was originally just an administrative tool, a quirk of history designed for efficiency back in World War I.
Right, just to make borrowing simpler.
Yeah. But over the last couple of decades, especially as political polarization has intensified, it's been transformed into this incredibly potent political cudgel used as leverage in budget fights.
And why is that so dangerous for the dollar specifically?
Because it strikes at the absolute heart of the dollar's global power,
Yeah.
trust. That power loop we talked about. It runs on the fundamental belief around the world that the U.S. government always pays its bills. Threatening to default, even if it's just a political game of chicken, shatters that core belief.
We really saw how close the U.S. came to the brink back in the 2011 standoff, didn't we?
We did. It was terrifyingly close.
Yeah.
Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner at the time, along with the Federal Reserve, they were forced to secretly prepare what they called a break glass plan.
What did that involve?
It was essentially a debt prioritization scheme. Horrifying stuff. They literally had to figure out, okay, if Congress forces a default, who do we pay first? Do we prioritize payments to foreign bondholders like China and Japan to maintain market confidence? Or do we prioritize Social Security checks for seniors? Military salaries. It was an impossible, unthinkable choice.
And just the fact that they had to create such a plan.
Was incredibly damaging to global confidence in U.S. political stability and fiscal responsibility. The immediate result was the credit rating agency Standard & Poor's downgrading U.S. sovereign debt from its top-tier AAA rating for the first time in over 70 years. A huge symbolic blow.
And the problem hasn't gone away. The stakes just keep getting higher.
Exactly. By the time we got to the 2023 standoff, the amount of debt subject to the limit was $17 trillion higher than in 2011. Foreign holdings of U.S. debt had doubled in that time. Wall Street banks were setting up actual war rooms again, planning for potential default scenarios.
And another rating agency acted.
Yeah, Fitch downgraded U.S. debt in 2023. And importantly, when they explained their reasoning, they didn't just cite the debt ceiling standoffs or rising debt levels. They explicitly mentioned a broader erosion of governance in the U.S., including concerns stemming from the political polarization, and specifically mentioning the January 6th Capitol insurrection as a factor undermining confidence in U.S. institutions.
So, wow, the spectacle of internal political dysfunction, Congress's inability to perform basic tasks like funding the government or paying its bills, that's now seen by the global financial community as a direct risk to the dollar standing.
Absolutely. It proves that point. Faith in the markets and faith in the stability of the underlying democracy are deeply intertwined. And this political volatility, this perceived unreliability, it just reinforces the second major self-inflicted wound.
Which is the overuse of sanctions we were just talking about.
Right. Because every time the U.S. uses sanctions, especially unilaterally, it pushes countries to think about alternatives. Former Treasury Secretary Jack Lew, who served under Obama from 2013 to 2017, saw this coming very clearly.
He issued a pretty stark warning, didn't he? Almost prophetic.
He did. His warning was basically this, and it's worth quoting. The more we condition use of the dollar and our financial system on adherence to U.S. foreign policy, the more the risk of migration to other currencies and other financial systems in the medium term grows.
In other words, the more you use it as a weapon, the less attractive it becomes as a neutral tool for everyone else.
Precisely. Every new sanction, no matter how justified you think it is from a U.S. foreign policy perspective, it adds friction, unpredictability, and cost for users of the dollar system. It makes them nervous.
And his prediction is already coming true, you could say. Look at the fallout after the U.S. unilaterally pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal.
That was a key moment. When the U.S. withdrew and reimposed sweeping sanctions, our key European allies, Britain, France, Germany, pillars of the Western order, were furious. Their companies had made investments in Iran based on the deal.
So what did they do?
They immediately started working on creating a special purpose vehicle, a kind of alternative payment system called INSEX, specifically designed to bypass the U.S. dollar system and allow trade with Iran to continue, at least for humanitarian goods initially. It was a clear signal of intent.
And it's not just allies. Adversaries are actively looking for ways out, too.
Oh, absolutely. Countries under heavy U.S. sanctions, like Venezuela, have actively experimented with alternatives. Venezuela even launched its own oil-backed cryptocurrency, the petro, explicitly to try and dodge dollar restrictions. Russia and China are developing their own cross-border payment systems.
So the financial world is actively building escape hatches, building alternative payment rails, precisely because the U.S. has made the dollar potentially too risky, too weaponized to rely on exclusively.
That's the heart of the matter. The U.S. has leveraged its exorbitant privilege so aggressively and combined it with displays of internal political instability that it's genuinely accelerating the global search for dollar alternatives.
It's interesting, though, when you look at who actually influences the dollar's value day to day now. Back in the Rubin era, the Treasury Secretary's words could move markets significantly. Is that still true?
Not really, no. The dollar's short-term, day-to-day value is now overwhelmingly driven by the Federal Reserve's monetary policy, primarily interest rate decisions.
Not the Treasury Secretary.
The Treasury Secretary can intervene in currency markets using something called the Exchange Stabilization Fund. But it's relatively small, only about $142 billion the last time figures were widely cited. That's peanuts compared to the trillions traded daily in the global currency market. So for short-term valuation, Fed policy is king.
But the Treasury Department still holds the keys to the dollar's long-term fate.
Absolutely. The Treasury remains the ultimate steward. It's responsible for managing the national debt, for the underlying fiscal policy, for the economic policies that determine whether the U.S. remains seen as a credible, trustworthy borrower in the long run.
So managing those debt ceiling fights, ensuring fiscal sustainability.
That's critical. The long-term durability of the dollar empire rests fundamentally on the Treasury's ability and Congress's willingness to navigate these manufactured political crises, avoid default, and maintain the perception of fiscal responsibility.
So we've traced this incredible story. The dollar went from being an immoral paper IOU during the Civil War to being crowned king at Bretton Woods, enjoying a golden age under the strong dollar policy, and then evolving into this potent but maybe self-destabilizing financial weapon.
Yeah, and the result is that now, really for the first time in maybe 80 years, the world is genuinely asking, is relying so heavily on the U.S. dollar still worth the trouble? Given the risks, the unpredictability from U.S. unilateral actions, and maybe even more importantly, the dangers stemming from America's own internal political dysfunction.
We're seeing real shifts happening.
You really are. You see major global players, not just rivals like Russia and China, but big economies like Brazil, India, even traditional allies in the Gulf states. They're all actively exploring alternatives. They're setting up direct trade channels, using their own currencies, building alternative payment systems, seeking stability through a more multipolar financial world rather than relying solely on the greenback.
And let's be clear, the consequences for the U.S. if the dollar were to lose its status as the world's primary reserve currency, they would be massive, not just for Washington's power, but for everyday Americans.
Oh, absolutely devastating. The most immediate and severe consequence, much, much higher borrowing costs for the U.S. government. If global demand for treasuries drops, interest rates have to rise to attract buyers.
Which means
Congress would be forced into making incredibly painful budget cuts. Defense, social programs, infrastructure, everything would be on the table. Washington's ability to project power and influence around the globe through economic statecraft would be drastically curtailed.
And for people at home,
Those higher government borrowing costs would inevitably trickle down. Mortgages would become more expensive, car loans, student loans, credit card rates would all rise, the cost of living would increase. You would fundamentally erode the standard of living that, in part, has been fueled by decades of cheap borrowing thanks to the dollar's status.
So ultimately, our sources seem to converge on this point. The fate of the dollar empire doesn't really rest on the strength of the U.S. military or even the absolute size of its economy anymore.
No, it seems to rest much more fundamentally on America's ability to govern itself effectively and maintain political predictability and stability at home.
That linkage seems critical.
It's the essential link. The integrity of America's public institutions, the health of its democratic process, these are now inextricably tied to the stability of the global financial system that rests on the dollar. Remember Bob Rubin? Even he, years later in 2021, made a call for democratic reform in the U.S., and he explicitly tied it together. He said, faith in democracy and faith in markets go hand in hand.
So the long-term survival of the dollar empire really depends on U.S. leaders, and maybe U.S. voters too, demonstrating that they can maintain a stable, predictable, functioning democracy and avoid tearing themselves apart with internal strife.
That seems to be the core message. If the U.S. continues down a path of aggressively weaponizing the dollar against foes while simultaneously allowing internal political chaos to undermine its own financial credibility,
Yeah.
well, the rest of the world will accelerate its search for alternatives. They're already doing it.
So the biggest threat isn't China or Russia developing a rival currency tomorrow. It's the possibility that the dollar's demise won't be caused by any foreign adversary, but by Washington itself.
A self-inflicted wound on a global scale.
That is definitely something to think about.